Hi friends, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the process colours and everything behind this roe deer drawing. Everything I've used for this is listed in the materials section of the description below, and if you want the full real-time coloured pencil tutorial then you can find it over on my website as part of my Club Puffin subscription. So let's get straight into this short tutorial. So one of the first things I started off with was just using a kneaded eraser to just gently lift the graphite outline. I do this on most pieces. I tend to just lift a little bit so that you can still slightly see the graphite underneath rather than lifting the graphite completely off. I find that when you lift it completely off you often lose the outline and you can lead to incorrect proportions and stuff. So just a little tip for you there, get yourself a kneaded eraser. And the first thing I actually did on this portrait was just block in all of the kind of shadow areas just by using a dark sepia pencil. So I went around the eyes, I added in the shadows in the nose, the ears and on the antlers as well. And this is a completely different way of working for me. I usually just work on little section by little section and I don't usually block in shadows, but for this I decided that I would, just so that I could kind of get the bone structure of the face down, and it really did help with this piece. So another really good tip for you is if you have something like a deer or a similar kind of creature, to block in some of the simple shadows first just to really get those prominent features in and just to get that bone structure going. I then followed through with completing the eyes just by adding in a little bit more dark sepia, blending out with a white pencil and adding in some sky blue and also some dark indigo as well, just to give the eyes a little bit of a reflection. And for the highlights in the eyes I just used a negative space method and just left that white of the paper showing through. I then went in and did the nose in a similar fashion, so just building up some sort of grey tones, so using a really light dark sepia, some warm grey 3, and again adding in those blues to hint at a reflection and to hint at shine. And then moving on to the fur. So this is where the fun kind of starts, and this kind of technique is followed throughout the entire deer. So just started with a really light base of some ivory, and I also blended over with some warm grey 1 in some places as well. So I used a blend of both of these pencils for warm and cooler toned areas. Now the warm grey 1 isn't a cool grey 1, but it kind of acts as like a colour for a cooler type of area in comparison to the ivory. So I mixed the ivory and the warm grey 1 in areas where there was a bit more of like a brown tone and it was a bit of a cooler brown tone. The ivory I kind of placed wherever there were any kind of really pinky, really orange and really yellow patches of fur. So I just paid attention to the reference photo, I looked at the shadowing on the face and the light direction and everything, and then just added those bases in. And then just went over and added in some midtones, so I used some burnt ochre, some Naples ochre, some terracotta, and then ever so slowly increased the saturation of those tones just by layering and layering, and then going in with some darker tones of brown to really hint at those shadows and to really get the bone structure in the face. So I just followed the kind of areas that I did previously with the dark sepia, just kind of mapping out, and just added in some darker browns over those areas. The ears were a really simple task, and these were really nice and pink inside, and they also held some really nice grey tones as well. So I limited my palette on this piece as I do with most of my pieces, so I had to mix my own kind of colours here, and the colours that I actually used were some ivory again as a base, and I also used some light flesh as a base as well. Mixing those two together gives a really nice peachy tone and is a good colour to have like all over on this kind of colour fur. And for the ear on the right hand side where it's a little bit more in the sunlight, I added in some alizarin crimson and some terracotta as well, and just made a bit more of like a brighter orange tone. So when you have some sort of light directions where you've got the light shining through ears, the best thing to do is to use some really bright colours and then add some shadows directly next to it. So as you can see on that ear that I've done there, I've got some really nice orange and some red tones in comparison to the left ear, and then I've got the dark outer edge, and then you've got some shadows like underneath that fluffy part on the ear as well. The antlers for this were really simple. The kind of technique you want to use for antlers is just by using some smooth shading, and you want to make sure that you blend out either with a solvent or a pencil, whichever method you prefer. I used a white pencil, and I think I actually used a warm grey 1 as well for this. And to get that kind of rough, kind of antlery texture, once I'd finished like adding all of the colours in, I then went in and just added a few simple lines, a few simple strokes with a sharp pencil of a darker colour. So using like a walnut brown or a dark sepia or even some burnt sienna, just adding in a few simple lines and a few simple areas of shading as well. It's just enough to hint at that texture there. So the next part of this deer was adding in all of the fur, and there is a lot of fur, and this particular kind of deer has these spots on the back. And the method which I used to hint at those spots was initially just putting down a layer of white pencil. So I used a Prismacolor white pencil and just kind of went in first of all before putting any layers down and kind of indented the paper and kind of made like a wax resist. And that often works, but when you have a lot of darker colours and a lot of layers to put down, you can often lose those white areas, which is what happened to me here. So it is a really good method if you want to go straight in with like a mid-tone. That's a really good idea to do that. And what I actually ended up doing, as you'll see later on in this footage, is actually using a scalpel just to etch out some of the white areas, which actually worked a whole lot better. But the combination and the sort of application of the colours here is just the same as what I did on the face. I started off with some ivory and some warm grey one as a base. So again, looking at the reference photo and adding the kind of warm grey one where you have more sort of darker brown tones, and the ivory where you've got some really strong, really nice peachy orange tones. So putting those down as a base, and again, as always, when you're drawing fur, you want to follow the fur directions. So the fur kind of changes direction all over if you're doing a full body like I am here. So you really need to pay attention to kind of how the fur and the skin and everything sits over the muscles on the legs, on the neck, and how that kind of transitions all together. You really need to pay attention to that and really make sure that you spend a long time with your base layers mapping out that fur direction, because that is absolutely essential. And then once you've got those base layers in, then you can go in with some mid-tones. You can go in with Naples ochre, some cream, some colours like that, some light flesh to get those really peachy tones, and then slowly build up your tones to work towards the darker colours. So with your darker colours, what you want to aim for is having them kind of sparingly throughout the portrait. So you're going to want to spend a lot of time adding in your mid-tones. So you want to just really slowly layer up, really get that saturation right. Then when it comes to your last few layers, you're going to use them less and less. So you want to use the lighter colours more at the beginning, and you're going to use those the most. And then as you get towards the darker colours, you're going to use those least. And with the darker colours, what I find a really good technique is, instead of like adding in loads of different hairlines to indicate your fur, what you want to do is just add one or two to just kind of hint at the shadows in between the fur. So if you actually study a real life animal, you'll see that they're not actually like made up of a whole load of dark areas. It's just the shadows underneath the fur. So just adding in a few simple strokes and adding in a few strokes sporadically here and there will give you a much more realistic look, and it's going to also make it look a lot less hairy, which is really good when you're working on something that is short-haired like a deer, or if you've got a short-haired dog, you want to add fewer strokes to make it look less hairy, if that makes sense. So when it comes to colouring around legs and things, as I said, it's really important. The key thing there is to make sure you get the fur direction in correctly. So really make sure you do spend a lot of time studying your reference photo. And also, just as I mentioned just before, the length of your strokes and how many strokes you put in can also play into how the fur looks on this particular animal. So you want to make sure that you use really short strokes, use some shading, use a lot of glazing as well, so just adding in really light layers of colour over the top of one another to slightly alter the tone, rather than going in and adding like all of these different hairlines. You want to make sure that you use mostly shading, and then with your darker colours just go in and hint at those shadows in between the fur, as I said previously. And the actual legs of a deer, they're the easiest part in my opinion, because the fur can be a little bit tricky, especially with shorter fur and all of the different sort of colour transitions and changes, and all of the kind of white patches are kind of difficult and you have to use some negative space methods. But the legs, you can actually just go in and shade the colours and then just blend with a white pencil. What I kind of went for here was the main focus was on the back end and the face of the deer, so those were the areas that I wanted to put in a lot of detail. So when it came to the legs, I wasn't too fussed about adding in too much detail. Just kind of shaded them in here and there, and then added in those soft subtle colours as well. One good tip for you guys if you are drawing a similar kind of fur like this is to use a dark indigo pencil to apply your shadows. So don't always go in with a walnut brown or a dark sepia, because that can often kind of muddy the colours and it can kind of make them look a little bit flat. Try and use some blues and some opposite colours, and a few darker reds in shadows as well. So some of the colours that you would find in the fur, so just darker versions, like a dark orange or dark red, and also apply a little bit of blue into your shadows with orange subjects as well. It really does transform the shadows and it gives a piece a whole lot more dimension. So that's another big tip for you guys if you're drawing something similar. As for drawing the actual deer, I don't really have very many other tips for you guys, apart from just keep your pencil layers really nice and light, try not to apply too much pressure, and again just pay attention to your reference photo, make sure that you keep those strokes nice and short, use a lot of shading, a lot of glazing, and then finally go in with your last layers and add some details with those darker coloured pencils. So that's pretty much it for this video. I really hope that you found some of these tips helpful when you're creating your own similar subjects. And if you want to follow along with this tutorial, I'll link the reference image that I actually used below so you can go and give it a go. It's one from Pixabay and it's free to use, so I'll link that for you below. If you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an upload, as I post new arty goodness every single Friday for you guys. Make sure you hit that notification bell as well so that you're notified as soon as an upload goes live. That's all from me today, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!